Hey friends, welcome to Homegrown Florida. I'm Katrina, and today we're going to be talking all about how 2024 went. All my successes, all my failures, and I started out the year with 6 main goals. The first one was to be able to grow a year's supply of food, and that's going to be certain specific vegetables I was focused on. So white potatoes, roselle, onions, peas, and hot peppers. The second thing I wanted to do was enough fruit production. So before this year, I was probably only collecting about 10% of what we eat in fruit from the garden, so I really wanted to increase that, and we did. The next area of the garden that I really wanted to focus on was flowers. So not just in the back with the garden, but up front as well. And I introduced a lot of new ones like medicinal flowers. I introduced some flowers that come from bulbs or roots, and then of course, flowers from seed. The next thing was preserving. So I have always canned and dehydrated for many years, but I introduced freeze drying last year, and I also introduced a lot of new canned vegetables that I had not done before, or recipes that I had not done before. I'm really trying to focus on only canning the things that we absolutely love. Canning takes so long. Freeze drying takes a long time, less work, but a long time. Dehydrating takes a long time. Growing it takes a long time. So you really want to make sure that you absolutely love what you're making and that you're going to use it. The last thing that I wanted to focus on, which was new for me this year, was medicinals. Now, I did dip my toes into medicinal recipes last year, but I wanted to kind of go big this year and see how much we could make of our own products. And so I did a lot of like cough and cold medicines, a lot of skincare stuff. And I'll let you know some of the stuff that worked and some of the stuff that I definitely need a little bit more practice on. One of my main goals is to grow a year's supply of certain types of vegetables. And this year was no different. I was focused on a few different vegetables: onions, peas, peppers, potatoes, and roselle. But I took a little bit different of approach this year than I had in previous years, because very early on I realized that I was not going to be successful at the peas and the potatoes. And it was mainly because I picked the wrong time to grow them, or not necessarily the wrong time, but I was very late in their growing season. So I got them in just in the nick of time, but it wasn't early enough to get them to produce for as long as I would like. So I knew that that meant like, okay, I was not going to probably get a year's supply of those particular vegetables. So I was going to do something different this year. And I was going to focus on trying to grow as much as possible and not necessarily trying to hit that, 1 year's worth of vegetables of certain things. Overall, I typically can grow about 70% of our vegetables with, some things, the rest of that 30% being things that I can't necessarily grow year round. I'm thinking broccoli here. I absolutely love broccoli, but we only have a short season for broccoli. And so typically I will buy broccoli the rest of the year. But this year, since I knew I wasn't going to hit that whole goal of growing those potatoes enough for an entire year, I wanted to do it a little bit different, and I wanted to grow a larger amount of a lot of different vegetables so that we could fresh eat as long as possible. In the past, I was so focused on doing those year supplies that meant that there were these long periods in my garden where nothing was producing. There was nothing being harvested for us to eat on a regular basis, and so we would lean into our canned foods, our dehydrated, and now our freeze-dried foods to eat those in replacement of fresher foods. So since I kind of was like backed away from the year's supply this year, knowing that I wasn't going to achieve as much as I had hoped, I started growing a lot of different things. I was growing lettuce and beets and carrots and potatoes and garlic and onions and sweet potatoes and peppers and tomatoes. I mean, you name it. I grew it in the garden. If we ate it, I grew some, and I had more space because I wasn't using a significant amount of space growing these year supplies. And I really felt like that was a change for me that was very beneficial. Throughout the entire season, we were eating fresh food all year round. There was only one point in time where we actually had to take a pause, and that was after some hurricanes in October. We had one hurricane right after another one, and the second one really just tore out all of my harvestable food. I was doing green beans, zucchini, some Seminole pumpkins, peppers, squash, and eggplant. And unfortunately, all of those plants that were fully mature and actually producing were taken out by the storm. So I did have a brief period of time in this year that I wasn't harvesting any fresh food, and we did, revert back to our dehydrated and preserved foods. I think if those storms hadn't occurred, we would have definitely went a different route with the goals, and we would have focused more on fresh eating. Having fresh food all year round, particularly fresh foods that we really enjoy eating, I might have switched it out, but I think I'm still going to be trying to achieve the year's supply goal in the future. But I might be switching things up a little bit to where if it's not one of those foods that I'm focused on growing a year's supply, like next year, I'm definitely going to try the peas and the potatoes again. But all the other foods, like sugar snap peas, green beans, beets, carrots, onions, peppers, all of those things where I'm like not as focused on doing a year's supply, I'm going to be mainly focused on trying to just get a good productivity in a limited amount of space. So that way we can at least eat it fresh. And if we have an abnormally large harvest, then I can preserve those items. I really love the idea of having vegetables that I can eat fresh all year round. We are an area that grows year round, so we might as well take advantage of that. Now, going back to the goal of growing something for a year's supply, the potatoes and the peas, even though I didn't achieve that goal, I did make a really good progress. And that progress was I found varieties that were highly productive in my specific garden. Everyone talks about Yukon Gold in Florida. They don't do well for me. I don't know what it is. They just don't do well for me. But the two that I have learned now, potato-wise, that do well for me is Cow White and Golden Nugget. For the peas, I ended up going with a Tall Telephone. And so even though I didn't hit that goal of being able to grow enough for a year, I was able to find a variety that would grow well enough that next year I can probably actually meet that goal. Another challenge that I experienced, especially with these potatoes, was how was I going to actually store them? Because I realized after I harvested these that I don't really have a good way of storing them. And so there's some experiments that I did this year. I'm going to tell you about them a little bit later to figure out how I can preserve these in a way that they can be eaten fresh all year round. The other one that I had a goal to produce a year's supply was Roselle. I showed those just a couple seconds ago. I would have hit that goal. I had finally gotten the right amount of plants that I needed, in the right space in the garden. They were just doing amazing, but unfortunately that hurricane came through and just ripped those plants apart right as they were producing. Just my luck. Now, some other plants that I did very well at was sweet potatoes, surprisingly, in a smaller space. So that kind of opens up my garden to different things that I can plant instead of sweet potatoes taking up entire huge amounts of beds. I also had a really, really good tomato spring season. Fall was a little bit of a challenge because once again we had those hurricanes and it really stunted my plants, and I also had some soil issues that I had to deal with where it was just overly too much nutrients in the soil that those particular plants didn't need. But overall, did really well from the year's supply of food, even though I didn't hit my goal. Now, my next goal was fruit production. So in 2023, I planted a bunch of fruit trees. Fruit trees are something where you have to really be patient because, when you plant them the first year, they're just getting adjusted to the new area. They're building their root system. The second year, maybe you might get some production, but it's not going to be like peak production. Then when you start getting into year 2, 3, 4, 5, that's when you're going to start to see some peak production. So I grew all kinds of fruit. We put in, I think it was we have 15 fruit trees. And we don't have a very large yard. We have I think it's a third of an acre, and a large portion of our backyard is taken up by our pool. But I was using the space as best I could, separating my trees by 12 feet. I'm keeping them short using a method that I learned from a book called Grow a Little Fruit Tree. And I'm also growing a lot of fruit trees in pots. Now, some fruit trees do well in pots and some don't. And so I've been testing out which ones I can handle keeping in very large pots and which ones, maybe aren't going to be super happy. Probably my biggest example is I have some plum trees, one in the ground, one in a pot. The one in the pot is just not happy. It does not like being in that pot. But some of the trees that did really well this year, the avocado tree, I was shocked. It was on its second year and it put off avocados. And I got about 20 to 30 avocados before the storms came through. Blackberries were on, I believe, year 3 or 4, and they produced a good amount. Although I think that next year I would get even better. Plums produced just a handful. This was just their, second year in the ground, so I didn't expect much. Blueberries did very, very poorly, so I needed to work on their soil to make it more acidic so that they could grow better. I also had to work on my pruning techniques because you really do need to be pruning some of these fruit trees to get them to be as productive as possible. My jaboticaba, I think I'm pronouncing that right. It's very tropical fruit. Love that fruit. Reminds me of a grape, like a big grape, but with a very interesting flavor. That one I've been growing in a pot. It did well. I didn't even expect it to produce this year, and it didn't produce significantly, but it was enough to really enjoy and get used to that. But the mulberries were probably the star of the garden this year because the mulberry trees were less than a year old and they produced so many mulberries. And I was down there hand picking these mulberries up off the ground because you're supposed to wait for them to fall to harvest them, because if they're not completely ripe, they don't taste as great. The other tree that did exceptionally well was my peach tree. This is my oldest tree in the garden. I believe it's somewhere between 6 and 8 years old. I've really lost track of how old it is. But I had always pruned it really heavy, and I had always thinned the fruit really, really heavy. And this year I was like, you know what? I want to see what happens when I don't prune it super heavy and when I don't thin the fruit. So I just did some very light pruning, and I did some very light thinning, and all of my peaches, well, let me not say all, 90% of my peaches were of good size. You can see that there are still a couple that were on the small side, so they could have probably been pruned a little bit more. But that kind of goes to show me that I don't have to be thinning as aggressively as I was. And I think it was like almost 300 peaches from that tree. It was amazing. Another big success from fruit was strawberries. I got into Brilliance strawberries. I was growing Chandler and Albicon before. Albicon, I just feel like does so poorly that's not even worth it. Chandler does very well. The strawberries are nice. They're just not as productive as the Brilliance. The Brilliance was super productive. I had strawberries, fresh strawberries, 4 months. Although, even though I had 30 strawberry plants, I didn't have a lot to be able to preserve for later. I mostly did some freeze drying. The other fruit that did super well this year for me was watermelons. I have always struggled with watermelons. I just didn't pick them right, couldn't get them mature, couldn't get the timing right. This year, all stars aligned, and I was able to grow watermelons. And I got my first round of watermelons with the first set of fruits. I believe I got 3 fruits from them, all of them over 20 pounds. I think my biggest one was 35 pounds. And I finally started picking them when they were more ripe. And it has been one of those labor of loves to figure out when it's ripe. Even here, it's not perfectly ripe, but it was as close as I've ever gotten. And I now kind of know that trick. Flowers was the next goal on the list. I actually started growing flowers back in 2023. I wasn't always a big flower person, and actually what got me into flowers was these types of flowers. This is a calendula. I also grew some chamomile. It's really, I was focused on flowers that had medicinal properties so that I could get into making my own medicinal recipes, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But I realized very quickly that flowers in the garden do something very significant to the vegetable garden. They have this symbiotic relationship, this helpful relationship between the vegetables, the pollinators, the pests, the good bugs, and the flowers. And it's almost like magic, because I'm pretty shocked at how much diversity it brings into your garden, just planting a few of them. And so I was able to plant a lot of flowers that were for my medicinal recipes, which I was very stoked about. I grew lilies. I'm trying to find the perfect lily to grow. Calla lilies did quite well. I'm not sure yet if they're going to come back. They are supposed to be perennial. They're supposed to be a bulbing flower that will come back. They lasted quite a while into summer, which was surprising for me. But then the tops died out, and I'm hopeful that when I get back from my trip, that I will be able to see that they have sprouted again. We'll see, fingers crossed. I'm really looking for flowers that will do well here in Florida that have bulbs and are perennials. That is something I've been focused on for a while. I am still focused on growing annual flowers, and my favorite ones this year had to have been the petunias, but I did try some different color cosmos, and those come very, very pretty. I tried a couple that, like this one, the daisy. It's a painted daisy, and it struggled because this isn't necessarily a flower known to grow well in Florida. It's more for northern climates. Unlike things like these nasturtiums, the petunias, the celosias, those are known for doing well here in Florida, while the painted daisy not so much. But I wanted to try it out and see what they look like. I'm particularly fond of petunias just because petunias come in so many different colors, shades, shapes. They grow very, very well. You can save the seeds. I'm really loving them. They're a little bit wild. I will say that. They're a little hard to keep under control so that they look nice and neat and pretty. But you guys know me. I'm not necessarily into being an extremely aesthetic looking garden as much as I am to being a productive garden. This is another one. This is called a ranunculus, and this is also a northern flower. This one I planted, it came up. It's a bulbing flower, kind of like the lilies. They died off, and I have not seen them return. So I'm giving them a little bit more time to see if they do, but I very much highly doubt that they'll actually return, which is okay. I think they're a beautiful flower, but there's a lot of other beautiful flowers, like native flowers. Like this is a Stokes aster, and then this guy right here is a starry rosinweed, and both of them I think are very beautiful flowers that are native plants, and they just do so well. During summer, I like to focus on a lot of flowers because there are minimal amounts of vegetables that I can grow. Now there's a lot of vegetables, but whether we like to eat them or not is a whole nother thing. So I focus a lot of the summer in keeping my soil covered. And I could cover it with sun hemp, which is great. It's good nutrition for the soil. It gets rid of root knot nematodes, but I also like some pretty. And I really got into sunflowers this year and came to really love the multi-branch, multi-head sunflowers like these. Sunflowers come in so many colors. They really attract the bees. They really attract all different kinds of pests, both good and bad. Also zinnias, those are a really good one that grows in summer, and they grow in these like bushy heads here, and then they grow in the single petal type heads as well. And both of those are great for summer gardening. My next goal for the year was more preserving recipes. Now, I have canned for so many years. Way before I even started a garden, I would get produce on sale at like a farmer's market or at a road shop, little stand, and I would preserve things that way. But I really got into it when I started having a garden and having all this extra produce, and what do I do with it? So I started canning, and there are certain recipes that we love to can. And I think when you first start canning, I think this is normal for everyone, you can everything, right? And then you start using it and you're like, I don't like this much. One of the things that stands out to me is one of the things that I canned was canned greens, which I absolutely hate. I hate to even say hate. I like blanching and freezing my greens rather than canning them. And so I've learned through the years that there's just certain things that I can and it will preserve well that we will never eat. And so this year I decided to go a different route. I actually got this idea from Becky over at Acres Homestead. She has been gardening and canning for a while as well. And she mentioned, that she'll have some stuff just sit on her shelf. And she's like, I want to can things that me and my family are going to eat. And I was like, just because it can be canned doesn't mean it should be canned. If you're not going to eat it, it's just pretty shelf, and that's not something that I live by. So I thought to myself, okay, let me start trying out small batches of items to see if we like them. This was carrots. This is a honey carrot that I made that we liked, but I think in the future I used broth and I added salt because that's what the recipe called for. And I'm like, next time, no broth, no salt, just honey and water, and I think that would have been tremendous. I like the texture of the carrots. I just didn't like the saltiness. That salt with the honey it was too much. The other thing I did a lot of this year was jams and jellies, which I have learned now that we don't eat a lot of jams and jellies. I mean, I still have an entire shelf full of jams and jellies that I'm like, what are we going to do with all these jams and jellies? But we do eat a lot of whole canned fruit, like our peaches. We went through our whole peaches very quickly. So I think if I do whole strawberries and whole, plums and whole mulberries, maybe we'll make better progress with that. I also wanted to try out some different things like dehydrating powders. Here I was making a fruit leather, trying it out in a little mini oven to see how well I can make fruit leathers. I found that we actually really like eating the fruit leathers. We also did sun-dried tomatoes, and then probably my biggest change in preserving methods this year was the freeze dryer. I got a Harvest Right freeze dryer this year, and I have been freeze drying everything, and there hasn't been anything yet that we have made and freeze dried that I have not liked. I did make these whole meals, and on our trip, we'll be trying them to see how we like them. And I'll update you guys on Instagram and Facebook stories. I'll also probably do a short here on YouTube to show you what it's like to rehydrate these and do they taste like the original. This one I'm very stoked about because these are great camping meals. These are great meals that you can throw in a backpack, and when you are out camping or off grid or whatever, just out in nature enjoying yourself, all you gotta do is add hot water. You don't even have to add hot water. You could technically add just cold water and it will rehydrate the food. I think these would be better heated, of course. But freeze drying has become our new favorite way, mainly because I can do whatever recipe I want, and then you just stick it in this machine and walk away. It makes the most amazing powders, like onion powder, garlic powder, basil salt. I mean, all kinds of stuff you can make with it. I'm freeze drying peppers, chili. I freeze dried onions. You can freeze dry pretty much everything, and all you do is just add a little bit of water and it just comes right back almost exactly as it was when it was fresh. The other cool thing about these is you can preserve them for a longer period of time. Now, canning you can preserve for a long period of time. Canning, they say 18 months, but as long as the seal is good, canned food can last a lot longer, but the nutrition starts to decline after that 18 months. But with freeze drying, it maintains 90+ % of the nutritional value of the food through freeze drying because it's not using this excessive heat process. And so because of that, you can have a strawberry that you freeze dried 10 years ago and bring it out and it has the same nutrition, which is something that we really strive for in our food. I don't want to just preserve it so it lasts long. I want to preserve it so it lasts long and it still feeds us and keeps the nutrients in our bodies and really, feeds our health. Speaking of health, the next goal was medicinal recipes. I've always been really just intrigued with medicine. I don't know if you know this, but I was in the healthcare IT field before I retired. And something specifically, pharmaceuticals was a big part of my career. And I always was just like, how do they come up with this stuff? I wasn't in like research and development or anything like that, but I was always just intrigued with how somebody thought, here, let me put these, chemicals together, and suddenly, it cures diabetes. Well, not cures, but it treats diabetes, or, you've got this cure for cancer or something, like it always shocked me. And I thought, where did these come from? Well, in the olden days, these came from plants. And to this day, a lot of them do come from plants. They just have different ways of extracting them. So I thought, I wonder if I can make some of our own medicine at home. So I started kind of slowly with things like oxymels, which is just a infusion of a herb with honey and vinegar, particularly apple cider vinegar. Then I got into tinctures, which is another type of infusion, but it is in an alcohol like vodka. Those last significantly longer. Oxymels and glycerates only last about a year, where tinctures can last like 5 years. Then I thought, what about skincare? So I started getting into all different kinds of calendula things like lip balms, lotion bars, soaps, and I started making those to see, like, are we going to use them? Are they as good as the products that you buy in the store? How do you respond, or how does your body respond to the herbs? Is it just as much? It was very much like a little scientific experiment in my home for me, which right up my alley. I love doing stuff like this just to see, first, if I can do it, and second, is it just as effective? I have found that some things are as effective, some things are not. And then also, some things I need a lot more practice on, like these cough drops here. I was trying to make a honey, lemon, ginger cough drop and get it to the candy hard crack stage so that it becomes more like, a cough drop. But I was not successful. I burned my honey. We're going to have to try that again. And I think that's a good lesson for when you are working or doing medicinals, that there is practice to it. And sometimes you don't always get it on the first try. I don't always get it on the first try. And that's okay. But you learn something new every single time. This was probably one of my favorite things that I made this year from a medicinal standpoint, and that was elderberry gummy berries. I made a bunch of elderberry recipes, elderberry syrup, elderberry tinctures, and then these elderberry gummy bears. And I just thought, number one, they taste really good. They taste like a honey bear. But the other thing is they're just so cute. And I know I shouldn't be doing stuff because it's cute, but I just can't help myself. It was just adorable. And the elderberry is very, very good. You do have to cook it, so be prepared for that. I also got into infusing oils. So I had been doing infused oils for a while now and making things like salves. That was the very first thing I ever made when I got into medicinals, just because I felt like it was more simple. You just put your herb in oil and you let it sit for 6 to 8 weeks, and then you take that out, you drain it, you separate it, and then you add some beeswax and melt it all together, and that's a salve, and you can use it for all kinds of things. But those infused oils had more opportunity to do things with them, and that's where I started getting a little bit more into skincare products as the year went by, doing those lotion bars, doing those lip balms. I made soaps. This next year I'm going to be doing some lotions and cleansers, and maybe even like an exfoliator. I don't know. I find this one has been my most productive thing that I make. I'm not 100% sure why. We just use it and it works so well and it smells so good, and it's stuff that you grow in your garden, so you feel good about using it. You don't have to worry about where all the ingredients came from. So absolutely love it. The other thing that I really got into for many, many years, way before I ever got thinking about medicinals, was teas. And so usually I just took all my different herbs, dried them together, and that I made my teas. But this year I started to become more specific of what I was going to put together. So this is like a chamomile and a moringa. So a vitamin with something to help me sleep. So I started focusing more and more on teas that had purposes. Now you could absolutely gain all the benefits from the different herbs using a tea blend where you just chuck everything together. It works just fine. I make an iced tea. I drink that tea all day long. That's what I drink, as I don't like water. I know. I like tea though. And so making these herbs, dehydrating them or just cooking them and then straining that off and, adding whatever sweetener of your choice, and you can make an iced tea out of anything. But having specific teas for like the holidays or for when you're sick or for when, you have anxiety or when you want to be able to sleep, those were big deals for me. The last goal I had this year, I stumbled upon, and I forgot to mention it earlier, but it was my goal for experiments. I wanted to try different kinds of experiments to see what works and what doesn't. This experiment was to grow a banana in a pot. I live in an area where it is possible to put bananas in the ground, but my winters in my particular microclimate can be a little rough on bananas, and there is the possibility that the banana won't produce. So I wanted to do it in a container. As of yet, here we are 20 months later, and that banana still has not produced. I'm going to keep it going. We're going to see. Now, the next one that I did was growing warm season crops during winter. Tomatoes, peppers, sweet potatoes, cucumbers, and I wanted to grow them in a green stalk. So once again, if it's winter and we get a nice cold snap, I can move this green stalk into my shed and protect it. The tomatoes did well. I was very shocked about this, especially in this area, because I was only getting about 3 hours of direct sunlight a day. The peppers did terrible. Cucumbers did terrible. Sweet potatoes did terrible. They just did not like the cooler temperatures. And mind you, I live in Florida, so it's not like we're dealing with super cold temperatures, but they don't like it. They are just not going to be happy. The other experiment I did, which I loved this experiment. I love any experiment that is going to take something that I think in my head of what the result's going to be and just completely spin it around. And that's what happened here. In a green stalk, I did 3 different types of soil. I did Promix, I did Miracle-Gro Organic, and I did Fox Farm Happy Frog soil. And I wanted to see which one would do the best at growing lettuce. And I picked lettuce because it's just easy, right? Lettuce just grows. And I put them in this green stalk, and the sprouting, was my first indicator that all 3 sprouted well. And I thought, okay, well, maybe they're all going to grow exactly the same. And that is not what happened. It was really shocking to me how well the lettuce did in the Promix. It just grew faster. It was more robust. It was the soil that ended up winning the experiment. Miracle-Gro did okay. It did better. And believe it or not, the most expensive, most popular soil, Happy Frog from Fox Farm, did the worst. The plants died, midway through for no reason whatsoever other than I can think like dampening off, I believe is what happened. I don't know why that soil just, maybe it's my environment, maybe it's Florida, the amount of rain that we get, the humidity, it didn't do well. And it's such an expensive soil, and so many people, say that it's so amazing. But for me, in this experiment, keeping all things the same lettuce, same treatment of the soil, same environmental impacts and everything, it was shocking to me. But it's also the reason why now, if you watch any of my videos after this one, I switched to Promix. I grow everything in my containers is grown in Promix now. That's how well this soil did. It completely changed me. Totally not sponsored. I have no relationship with them whatsoever. I'm just telling you how much I loved it. I even used the Promix to grow my another experiment, which was growing sweet potatoes. So I put some Promix in there. I did mix some native sand because I've noticed that a lot of my sweet potatoes in my beds are not doing as well. They're not producing as well. And I think that's because the soil in my beds is so nutrient dense from all the compost and the organic mulches. So I put some sandy soil and some Promix, and I grew a a lot of sweet potatoes in a 2 square foot spot in a green stalk. And I was blown away with how many I can grow like this. And honestly, it really has changed the way that I will grow sweet potatoes in the future. I'm definitely going to do them in containers going forward. Now, potato experiment, we talked about this earlier, growing a year's supply of potatoes. Once I do grow them, like, how do I store them? So this was another thing that I experimented with, and I tried 3 different ways of storing these white potatoes. I cured them in my spare bedroom, which went great. The skins thickened up, and then I put some in these paper bags in a hallway where it's just regular temperature in my house, about 72 degrees. Other ones I wrapped in newspaper and put them underneath the bed of a room that has the coldest temperature. And then the last one was putting them in the refrigerator, which I know people say don't put them in the refrigerator because of the way that they convert starches to sugars. But I did have a garage fridge, so I turned the temperature up in the garage fridge to 40 degrees, and that was the trick. That is how I can store my potatoes in the future. Really fun experiment. I hope you enjoyed doing this walkthrough with me of all of the goals from 2024, but hang out next week. We're going to be talking about what are the goals for 2025 that's going to help you set your goals up, as well as hear what the goals are for Homegrown Florida. Thanks so much for hanging out with me today, guys. Happy gardening.